I'll go ahead and just say, thank you for joining. Welcome to day 2 of the summit. I think we have a pretty exciting lineup today, just like we did yesterday. We'll start off with a presentation from Andres. Then at 4:30, we'll move to a presentation with Eric Pate over in Panama City. And then this evening, we have for our social hour, a presentation from Bruce Stevenson, on John Nolan and the awarding of the John Nolan Medal. If you missed anything from yesterday, you should have a link in your email to the recordings from yesterday's presentations. I want to give a quick thank you to our sponsors. We could not do the summit without you. And I would like to especially thank Fishback Dominic for sponsoring this session that you're part of now. And with that, I'm really pleased to hand it over to Andres Duany. He's a founding member of CNU and a co-founder of DPZ Co-Design. And honestly, I think you can, at this point, call him legendary in the field. So Andres, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, how are you? This is Bo Schwan to my right, who's helping me technically. And there he is. And so today's presentation, just a little bit of background. I've had the good fortune of having some work to do, some commissions that are flexible enough to explore the current situation. You know, the post-COVID, the post-pandemic, et cetera. They weren't commissions that came with this in mind, but obviously developers want to study what the prospects are. And I've spoken to quite a few people about the situation with COVID and how it affects architecture and urbanism. And it takes an awful lot of time to just establish the setting. You know, how is this different from everything else? And one of the problems is that I think the majority of people think we're going to go right back to the way it was. And pretty quickly at that, they just say things like, oh, it's just the vaccine. Or they say, well, you know, after the last pandemic, it was just the roaring 20s and it all came back. And so today, I am going to do a little bit of an attempt to set the scene for what essentially will be a presentation of work that doesn't look particularly like doctrinaire new urbanism, which I'm going to show partially at the end of today and partially my next presentation, which is what, Thursday? It's Thursday. But may I assume I have an hour? Is this an hour, including questions? Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. You have an hour.
Okay, great. Okay, so I don't know, since this is not a standard lecture, it's kind of a meandering thoughts. I don't know how much time they take or not, but I have some backup work to show, and of course there are plenty of questions, I'm sure. So let's start this way. From the very fundamental issue is we have to realize that for urbanism, the present is a distortion field. You know, if you were to, for example, and just to do something that most of you have visited, if you take the beach at Seaside in 1980, all you could do is sell the frontage with townhouses, maybe not even that. The back had no value at all. In order to think of something, what became Seaside, you had to ignore the present. And you had to think about what it might be like 20 years hence. Because the present told you you can do nothing. Now, what we conceived, thinking 20 years ahead, was based on the knowledge of history, that knowing, for example, that those people who laid out the great cities of the West, you know, whether they be the San Franciscos or the Seattles or the Chicago, also looked forward 20, 30, and 40 years ahead, which is why they laid out these enormous grids when all there was a whole lot of empty land. And of course, the world's greatest example of that is Washington, D.C., which is conceived as a world capital when there was nothing but teepees and log cabins in essentially a swamp. That was really an achievement. So the first thing I ask you is remember that our field of endeavor is all about the future. It is the most future-oriented of all human endeavors. We don't have to come up for election in 4 years. We don't have to make a payment or meet the meet payroll in 2 weeks. We don't have to report to investors in 1 year. We're thinking 1 and 2 generations ahead. Okay, so get into that mindset so that it doesn't seem so weird. Now, so the 20th century started 20 years ago. The 21st century started 20 years ago, and there's been a lot happening. It's accelerating. It's not moving as fast as the 20th century, you know, with the First World War, that actually threw away 5 empires and went from the Belle Epoque, the most beautiful time in Europe, to the deadliest war until that time. Very, very quickly. It turned on a dime into a miserable century. At least the first half was quite miserable, particularly for Europeans. So let's bear in mind that this century, however great the changes are, they're less than last century. And what can we learn from that situation? And what can we learn from the earlier situation when there was actually the great move west of the United States and the Civil War? Okay, so that the context is we're thinking in a big way in time. So let's talk about the events of this wonderful beginning of the century, in which it was, you know, we had won the Cold War, etc. And then came the great meltdown of 2008. And then came the consciousness of climate change, also around 2008. That's when Al Gore did his film. And that's looking worse and worse by the year. Every Paris report is worse. And then we're looking at the pandemic that brought a lot of things to light. You know, it accelerated many of the downward trends. And there's something coming up next, which is the potential with the election of a great deal of social instability. By the way, which is not that odd in this country if you were around in 1968, nor is it odd in the rest of the world. You know, a lot of Europe was very unstable in the 1960s. I mean, with bombs and assassinations, etc. And of course, Latin America, there's nothing to be said about Latin America. It's always unstable. And so we have to understand that things can go wrong just by looking at history and looking outside our borders. And then the other thing, which I find astonishingly ignored, is that we're broke. I mean, I could actually throw some graphs at you to say, we haven't got any money. And the private sector has no money at all. I mean, the middle class can't retire. They can't, many of them can't make a payment 2 weeks from now. The government is totally broken. By the way, this does not even take into account the tremendous medical bills of COVID. I was listening to something this morning, and it's incredibly expensive taking care of everybody. Not just the vaccines, but all the hospitalizations, et cetera. That bill is coming due. So one of the things that we have to confront is that this incredibly wealthy country actually has no money. At some point, it can't keep printing it. And that's a fact. So we have a financial situation, we have a social situation of instability, we have climate change. I mean, a lot of things coming together. So I'm going to speak about that context. And I think that the topic, perhaps the title of this talk, I just worked this out with Liz, is the new urbanism going to be canceled? You know, are the technologies that we have, are the principles that we have, are they something which was completely necessary, viable, and wonderful in the 20th century, but it turns out not in this one? So that's the question. Is the new urbanism going to be canceled, to use a very modern term? Now, there are two things, one of which is much better news than the other. The first one is climate change. Now, what was coming up relatively soon is that climate change, we're losing the war. You know, when the next Paris report comes out, the next code of the International Committee on Climate Change, the ICC report, the metrics are all going the wrong way. And so climate mitigation, the mitigation, in other words, reducing the impact of atmospheric carbon, it's not going away. And that was something that the new urbanism can contribute to, but principally by reducing tailpipe emissions. Okay, that's our thing. You reduce tailpipe emissions, by making transit viable, and that's a tiny little contribution. The other contribution, which is not ours, it's the one of LEED, is about buildings. Buildings that actually don't consume or don't generate carbon. But there's lots of other things that are going right ahead, and it looks like the war on climate change, the mitigation of climate change is not going to work. Now, the good news is that there wasn't that much that we can do about it, the mitigation, but I meant to say the bad news is there wasn't much we can do about it, but there's some good news. Once we realize that climate change cannot be mitigated, then we have to adapt to it. Adaptation to climate change, and at that point, the new urbanism is absolutely central, okay? Our toolkit is right in the middle and right at the scale of what we can do for adaptation. It was incredibly exciting. It's very, very empowering to the new urbanism as long as we focus on adaptation and not on mitigation. But that is not what we're talking about today. We're going to talk about the other and that's what we were talking about January, February, March. We were all talking about that in all the internets, in our lectures, etc. But now we have something else coming up, which is the pandemic. And the pandemic is different. And it doesn't overlap with climate change, although it does accelerate some of the negative metrics, some of the consequences of it. It accelerates, it's earlier than we thought. Okay, so let's talk about the pandemic. The pandemic at first, and maybe at last, is a disaster for new urbanism. And just at a very short list, and the list can be a lot longer, I'll tell you what seems to be on the trash heap of history. Like if you ask regular folk in a very simple political way, this is what's on the trash heap. Density. Yes, and you can actually have all sorts of subtle arguments, but density is a problem, okay, being close to people. Second, transit is a problem. People don't want to get in the subway or the buses with anybody else. They don't even want to get into an Uber that hasn't been cleansed from the last passenger, okay? So transit is a problem, which means that the walking is good, but the car is back. Like the sales of cars, including used cars, is absolutely through the roof. Just like the sales of single-family houses is also through the roof, okay? There's something else that we don't often think about. There's a lot of social instability now. And when people are poor, you get you get theft. You don't get this isn't real crime, okay? It's not people murdering each other, et cetera, but there's a lot of crimes of opportunity. What's called marauding. People who actually test your car to see if you haven't locked it and see what's in it. It's people who sort of rattle at a gate or rattle at a doorknob or wait for somebody, not to kill them, not to harm them, but just to say, I'm taking your wallet, okay? This, by the way, is absolutely normative in history for thousands of years. We've gone through a period in which that has somewhat disappeared, and most of us live in places where this doesn't happen. Yes, it's happening. I mean, I had no idea that the crime rate in Miami was so bad until Scott Bernstein let me know, because I live in a place that doesn't suffer particularly from crime. But in the overall, it's shocking how much crime there is here. And we just don't know how many people actually live in kind of fear of theft. And by the way, I know France, I've come to know France pretty well too. Everybody there lives in fear of theft. And it's kind of shocking. Bars and lock your doors and all this stuff. And I said, really? But this is France. I said, oh yeah, that's the way it is. So open communities, something we've advocated for absolutely very strongly. Filter through the community. They're opened. No gates, no barriers, no walls, okay? Is that in jeopardy? And then we have face-to-face retail. The wonderful experience of going up to somebody, the jolly man at Monica's Market at Seaside, and the lovey-dovey conversation of gossip and all that. That's all a problem. No, you don't want to talk to people like that. You don't want to be that close. You don't want to, you actually just want it coming in anonymously by somebody that drops it on the door, an Amazon delivery person that drops on the door. So face-to-face retail, Main Street. By the way, I am not talking about the main streets being the riots burning the main street. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about the difficulty that people have right now. Is it worth really getting a battery for my watch? Really? You know, is it really worth getting this gift I got framed? Do I go to the frame store? Is it worth my health? It used to be a pleasure to do that kind of thing, you know, to see what's up at the shops. No, that's gone. And then there are the social third places, the great ideal of new urbanism, the third place, you know, the cafes that we work so hard to generate and encourage, you know, the beer places, the deck up at Seaside, you know, all the friendly places, principally in the eateries. The third places, they're in jeopardy. And then we have governance. There is, frankly, you know, we think the federal government is dysfunctional. There's an awful lot of stuff locally that is dysfunctional. You can't do things by Zoom. You can't show up at the public hearing and make the case. You know, I've done a project in Vero Beach that I'll show you later. I can't be there and sort of, you know, gesticulate, etc. Everybody's on a screen. It's very, very difficult to actually have a public, what's called community engagement. This charrette, how are we going to do community engagement, which is so personally? Have you seen how people respond to screens? You know, they sit there impassive. I'm not going to gesticulate. I'm not going to, you know, respond to this guy. It's a screen, you know? And so, yes, we have that in trouble too. So to summarize, and by the way, there's a list, I could double that list of tenets of new urbanism that are in trouble. But Liz and I would summarize it as this. What's generally in trouble is urban living. Okay, regardless of its pleasures, you know, regardless of the fascination of other humans. This is something to realize. Humans are very interesting to other humans. That's why we love passersby. That's why we love to be in public. But guess what? The stranger is danger. Until proven otherwise, okay, the person you don't know is a problem to you. You know, after a long while, as you get to know your neighbors, et cetera, and certain people you know are taking great care of themselves because you see how they take care of themselves. Okay, you see them, you say, I trust you. Okay, I'll talk to you on the sidewalk instead of crossing the street. I'll invite you to my yard. You know, let's have a drink together. You know, we have some coffee tables. We can do it spaced at 20 feet. I might even have dinner with a very special person indoors. By the way, in an extra large table, just in case, you know, there's a lot of myth going on. But the stranger's danger. But it's being overcome by something very curious, which is a circle of trust. I think all of us have realized that there are people that we trust, and these people that we trust, we bring in. So the question is, not yet. The question is, if this circle of trust has a physical manifestation that we need to do, then we need to know about. And I believe there is, and we need to observe that. What is the physical manifestation, not of the stranger, but of the circle of trust? By the way, there's nothing unusual about this. This stranger has been danger throughout history. You know, the fellow coming over the hill, he was most probably somebody coming over to steal something or to attack you. You know, the army was coming over to get you. So the stranger has always been danger. And now it's coming back. So let's see what that means. So what are we going to do about it? The first thing is to speculate as to how long this phenomena will last. Is this just a bump on the road? And so that in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, we're right back to where we were, you know, and it's fine. The new urbanism can actually stay on the main road. Okay, is this a bump on the road towards the advent of new urbanism, or do we have to develop an off-road vehicle? Not all the time, but for circumstances. Does the new urbanism have an off-road vehicle? Can we handle things when the tenets and the premises and the doctrines and the techniques don't work? And I think plenty of them may not be working. So let's find out, let's think about what happens when how long this might last. And one of the dumbest answers, which I see, it's amazing, it comes from people, is, well, the vaccine, just the vaccine. Well, it's not for me to tell you the limits of the vaccine, but the vaccine may last a year or two. The virus may mutate just like the flu. And furthermore, it's going to take years before we develop herd immunity. So whatever it is, it's years. Now, those years are going to be searing years. They're really tough. They're really unpleasant. You can pick up the New York Times today and learn about suicides. You can learn about post-combat, what's it called? The combat, the shock of combat. I forget what the four initials are. There was an article in the New York Times about it. The kids are growing up with people who don't have smiles and faces. Like, what does that do to them? Is the world just eyes and not faces? And so however short, and it ain't going to be short anyway, okay, however short the pandemic is, the actual medical phenomena is going to be limited. The cultural phenomena might last a very long time. It might be the defining event. So let's talk about another thing that I hear all the time that doesn't sound so smart. They said, remember the pandemic of 1918? Well, the pandemic of 1918, which killed between 50 and 100 million people, not 1 million, which is what we have lost now, and the world is 7 times more populous than 1918, and they lost 50 to 100 million. How did they respond to that? You know what answer I get when I mention that? People say, oh, then came the Roaring 20s, and it was over, and we all parties. Let me tell you a few things about the Roaring 20s. First of all, to use modern terminology, that was one market segment. Okay, that is the market segment which now goes to Margaritaville. Okay, that's how they deal with climate change. Margaritaville, they go to the villages, and these are people who are going to party on. Of course, that's the market segment. And by the way, that market segment in 1918 or in 1921-22 was urban, they were young, and they were rich. Okay, what happened to the other 98% of the people? What were they doing? Well, they were responding different ways. Some of them were rioting in Germany and becoming communists and then Nazis. There was an awful lot of people who were actually going to California because they were incredibly poor and ill. There were a lot of different responses. We cannot focus on the Roaring 20s. Okay, there were lots of things that happened all over the world. And by the way, let's stop thinking just of America. Okay, what happened in countries that were closer to our situation now, such as Europe was at the time. Let's look at Europe as well. And let's not be so provincial. So what this response to the pandemic of 1918, what were the permanent changes? Well, as it happens, a couple of them were actually in the wheelhouse of the new urbanism. There were 2 things that happened that occurred permanently. The first one, and you have to think about this, and you have to look at the books and look at the writing back in 1920, modern architecture came in basically as a response to health. Okay? Those white buildings of Alvar Aalto and Neutra and Le Corbusier, they could be wiped down. Okay? That furniture made out of tubes, that furniture that didn't have upholstery, that's so germs couldn't live in the upholstery. Those big glass walls, before they had no double glazing, they would still, in the winter, everywhere in Europe, they would have huge glass walls because of the sunlight. And then outdoors, decks everywhere, balconies, big decks, bigger than we have today. And then people changed their habits. They didn't go to the beach before. Then they went to the beach all the time. And guess what else they did? They moved to Florida because they understood that air and sunlight. They instinctively knew that vitamin D protected you from the virus. Then, just as it does now, they knew that sunlight cured you. So you get people moving to Florida. By the way, before, we think people moved to Florida before because of air conditioning? No, sir. Because of air conditioning. Before air conditioning in the 20s. And they moved to Southern California. Everybody was in Northern California, San Francisco, etc. Then they moved to Southern California in the 20s. And then they moved to the desert Southwest. And then they stopped going to the Baltic for vacations, and they went to Spain for vacations. And they went to places where they could have oranges. And you can see it in the writing of the architects. You know, the fruit, the air, the outdoors, the exercise, you know, all of this stuff in the Le Corbusier renderings. So guess what happened? Modern architecture, you think it didn't have a permanent effect? What do you think about modern architecture? You know, there really are books, which I think are completely idiotic, that say that modern architecture came back as a neurotic response to the First World War. You know, oh, it drove those people crazy. You know, Gropius was just a cavalry officer, German army. He was absolutely crazy, so he did that. That's not true. Okay, yes, they got sick and tired of the fog, and they got and of the mud. You know, you can read about that in Robert Graves. But they also wanted sun and air, and that brought modern architecture in, and that became permanent. The other thing that came in, and you have to think about this, if you look at the history of urbanism, most American cities, right from the beginning, consisted of single-family houses, and they grew in the increment of the neighborhood. But the neighborhoods were bolted on. They were organic, and they bolted on. Think of Chicago, just growing up, neighborhood by neighborhood by neighborhood. Look at all the cities that you know, just growing in, neighborhood by neighborhood. What happened in the 1920s? They started designing new towns that were separated from the city and connected by streetcars. What is Shaker Heights except exactly that? What is Coral Gables except exactly that? What is Beverly Hills except exactly that? In fact, Robert Stern, in his book called Paradise Planned, which is about these garden cities, he has 870 examples worldwide. And people say, well, they're just better designed neighborhoods. Well, they were neighborhoods and they are better designed, but they're also not bolted on to the existing city. And not only were they not physically associated, they were governed differently. And so there's also that, and we need to bring up government, okay? So to summarize, yes, the 1918 pandemic had a huge permanent effect on things that have to do with us. And I believe this one is gonna have a huge permanent effect again, even if in 3 years, we won't be as fearful of death. By the way, I think we will be, but that is, that's just my So what are the physical responses that we know about already, Okay, here it is, sunlight and fresh air. Wow, I read another article this morning from the New York Times. You know what it was told you about? What about opening the windows? Why does the New York Times write an article about opening the windows? You know, by the way, after it discards air conditioning and dehumidifiers and all this stuff, it says, why don't we open the windows? That's the best thing. Why do we need to be told to open the windows? Because we have forgotten to open the windows. And even when the windows open, we've forgotten them. We don't think about opening windows, we the new urbanists. We don't. We talk about it. A little bit about cross ventilation, but we don't talk about fresh air. We are not serious about the design of public space in adjacency to the house. It's very token. We are really not serious about the design of parks and squares. We put buildings on all four sides. Look at every single new urbanist rendering and tell me they're identical for 30 years. Here's the thing. What do our civic buildings look like? Identical churches every time with one tower, all of us. The same thing over and over again. Just doctrinaire response without thinking. Well, light and air. Here's another thing we don't never think about. We're now thinking very hard about ADUs. You know, the accessory dwelling units. That's nothing compared to what needs to be done. We need compounds, whole compounds, where families of great complexity, where societies of great complexity live together. You know, we need not only myself and my kids and my parents, but we need people who could help us, you know, maybe protect us. maybe take care of the older folk. Maybe we need to live with a school teacher, somebody that can teach the kids. You know, and here we are struggling, scratching at the ADU when we need to do is bring the compound full force back. You know, allow people to design their own small societies. Throughout history, people have lived in compounds. The second thing is the self-determination. Okay, the fact that you actually do your own zoning in your own compound, the fact that you have to decide, you should be able to decide what your public space is going to have. Maybe what you need is a croquet field, you know, so that you can actually socialize a little bit. Maybe you need an outdoor picnic table. And you know what? You shouldn't have to go to City Hall to get a permission to put a ping pong table on a swale. Okay, you shouldn't have to do that. But one of the problems we have, and I get back to this all the time, there's nothing between the house and City Hall. There's no subsidiary levels of governance, you know, at the level of the house, at the level of the compound, at the level of the block, at the level of the neighborhood. You know, it goes all the way to City Hall, to the municipal level. That's the way it goes in Miami, all the way to City Hall. And yet decisions are very local and they need to be made at all these levels. So the software, we have to work on that software. And that software of decisions being made locally has a physical implication. You know, what is a compound? How do compounds agglomerate? So let us say that 12 compounds can actually afford to build a school building, you know, for an education pod. Maybe another series of compounds needs a pool. Maybe another one needs a vegetable garden. Maybe another one needs a parade field to teach the kids how to use a AR-15 safely. I mean, you know, let them decide, and let them not decide at the level of the feds or at the level of the state or at the level of the city. Okay, decisions are to be made at every subsidiary level. And there's some very interesting physical implications to the new urbanism, which I can show you. I'm going to show you later, particularly the next day. We need to rethink the internal space of the dwelling. Is a bedroom really what people expect when they're living together in lockdown? Just the bedroom? Perhaps the bedroom should be a bed sitting room. Perhaps it should be a studio. You know, why is a bedroom? Can a bedroom not be a place equivalent to, let's say, an apartment in London, a little apartment in London, or a little apartment in San Francisco? It's just a matter of thinking about it. It's just a matter of allocating space. And then there's the arrangement for security. We hate to talk about social instability. Can't stand it. Ugh, just look south, okay? Just think about what's happening now. Just think about what's gonna happen one way or the other with this election, okay? Just think about the memory. Do you know how many guns were sold last month in America? 6 million last month. And there was an article again in the New York Times, how most people don't want to buy them. They don't want to buy the gun. Of course, it's horrible. I don't know how to use it. It's expensive. Why are they doing this? And are we just going to say it shouldn't happen? Or are we going to say, hey, maybe if we design things properly, and not just windows on the street, but if we design things properly, if we introduce building types like compounds, like courtyard houses, if we actually create highly securable places, you know, physically securable places, not all the time, you can leave the gates open, but when things get tough, maybe you close it. And there's the analogy of the medieval building, the medieval town. You know, these people that have these walls, these beautiful towns, the Bastides in Europe. When you look at them, you look at the wall, and the wall is barely thicker than a house or barely taller. So why did they bother to build a wall when you actually, you know, perfectly well, you could just knock them down? No one's going to be kept out. If some little army or a little bit of marauders came in and wanted to get into these little towns, they could get in. Just a matter of taking a couple of days. But you know what they did? If this town were better protected, they would be deflected to the next town, which wasn't as well protected. That is exactly how thieves work. They look at a place and they say, this one looks tough, this one looks complicated, let's go to the next one, okay? We're not talking about criminals, okay? Wanton criminals. This isn't a movie. We're talking about people who are hungry and people who can actually be scary because they're hungry, and some of them are going to be angry. Okay, we don't have to keep them out. We just have to deflect them, so they don't actually consider coming at us. One of the stupidest things I ever heard was when I was saying, I live in a courtyard house, by the way. Right now I'm looking at it out that window. I live in a courtyard house. It's a courtyard. It's incredibly safe. And somebody said, well, it's not going to stop an RPG grenade. You know what that is? It's a rocket propelled. It's a Russian rocket propelled grenade. Well, no, it's not going to stop an RPG. I get it. But at the same time, if somebody's looking to come and rattle my doors, they're going to go to the next house that isn't a courtyard house. That's what I'm talking about. It's very soft design, and we need to confront that. So now, how does this all coincide? All these things that we know, all these things that we know about COVID, it's not that many. Fresh air, the stranger is danger, and so forth. How does this coincide with climate change? I think that we're thinking about. We have to think about this. I don't have that digested at all. I have a drawer that's called climate change adaptation, and then I have another drawer which is called post-COVID design. I haven't yet blended them into a single proposal, urban proposal, okay? I do keep one thing in mind, that in the case of both, what we design has to allow life to be worth living. It has to be really pleasant to live in a COVID world or in a climate change world, in a climate disaster world. And maybe not forever, and maybe not for everybody, but we have to bear in mind that these places have to be extremely pleasant. So we have to turn the problem into an asset. And the projects I'm going to show you, and maybe one today and one the next day, actually managed to do that. They really alerted me to beautiful ideas like light, air, sunlight, etc. Okay? Now, a couple of things I just want to bring up that are not integrated. So the task is, how do these two coincide in our toolkit? COVID and climate change. And the second thing is, okay, we need to confront how these do not coincide with the charter of the new urbanism. Okay, what is it about the charter that is preventing us from even seeing the problem? Because I think the problem with the new urbanism for the last, it's been a couple of decades now, is that we're the paradigm, we know what the doctrine is, but the doctrine has become dogma. Yeah, and I see this all the time. When I present these projects, which for me are quite pleasant, they don't coincide with the new urbanism, with the doctrines, and the backlash is horrendous. And I'm going to show you just one which is amazing. I'm going to show you a few slides. Hey, the garage is the most interesting room in the house. It's the most convertible. What are we doing putting it in the back when the garage is actually the fundamental live workplace? You know, that's where you work. It's like having a little warehouse attached. So I say, let's put the garage in front and design it as the workplace. Oh my God, the backlash on that, you can't even believe it. You know, it's just like, okay, doctrinaire and not good. I want to even take that to the next level. The new urbanism looks like the new urbanism mostly. Okay, that's normal in architecture, everything converges. But you can look at the work we did for Katrina, in which there were dozens of firms, very compatible aesthetic. We can look at the work 20 years before Katrina, identical looking work, identical renderings, and we look at the work now and it's identical. Well, what happens if in fact the aesthetic is a problem? What happens if the aesthetic is actually oppressive to those people we want to include? You know, maybe the Latinos are scared of the Anglo look. Maybe the Blacks are reminded of bad times, you know, when actually, it's paradoxical. I don't think they're necessarily reminded of bad times when their white masters lived in columned houses. I think that porches may remind them of really decrepit neighborhoods that they'd love to leave. you know, and they want to live in ranch houses. I mean, many new urbanists know this. You know, have we really studied the aesthetic? Or are we still saying, oh my God, the proportions are so bad, assuming that there's only going to be one architecture, that there's a new urbanism architecture? No, I think we have to enormously increase our DNA. And it isn't just with more modernism in terms of light and air and health. We need to confront the possibility that the aesthetic of the future is the warehouse, is actually the warehouse district. And I'm going to show you some buildings that do that. You know, that is the look. And I have some evidence that actually the young people are much more interested in that. So I want to bring that up. And the other thing, I think all of us need to do this. I don't want to see any more slides personally of beautiful New England towns. You know, I know I've had it. You know, with beautiful New England towns, the ever better porch, the most beautiful. Okay, we need to increase our DNA. And the DNA needs to look at shanty towns. What is the American shanty town? What is self-building? What is redneck engineering? You know, what happens when people build for themselves? What does it look like? What do we allow? Okay, so let's look at an American shanty town. What about the Mormon initiative of the Southwest, the compound? There is so much to be learned from the Mormons. You know, the Mormons built over 700 new towns in 55 years. And not one of them failed. And they did it without money and in the desert where nobody wanted to live. And they were self-sufficient and economically successful. What do we know about that? You know what the new urbanists do about affordable housing? They say, well, how can we get better government grants? How can we lobby government to actually give grants to what we like? Like, well, we did Hope 6 already. That's done. And besides, government's going to have no money anyway. Okay, so why are we looking at the government? Why are we looking at the WPA? You know, the WPA, there were different society. Okay, that was the greatest generation. We don't have that. So let's get over that ideal. But what about the Mormons? Those were tough people in tough times. Let us see what they did. We also need to study, for example, the operations of the Bastide towns. You know, those delightful little towns in southern France built by the English in a hostile environment of Frenchmen. What about the warehouse districts? What about Wynwood here in Miami? So many warehouse districts are the coolest places. What's that aesthetic? What is it that's so appealing to young people? You know, what is it exactly that you can actually build? You know, what would happen if you can actually build very tall square footage with Walmart technology, you know, big box technology at $27 a square foot, including the air conditioning? Like, is that not amazing? And what about the mobile home industry? Have you seen how sociable mobile home parks are? We don't look at this. We're all feeding ourselves the same old DNA, okay? So I don't know how much time, how much is it? I have some slides that I have just 12, 13 minutes. I have some slides I want to go very quickly, not show you a project. I'll do that next time. I just want to show you the kind of slides that I get. Okay, I'm going to show you some villages. This one is in Egypt. You know, this seems like it's ageless. Most of these villages are actually built. All of the villages are built and are working today. They're not abandoned. So look at this village called Damas. Got it? See it? Okay, amazing. Next. Look at the layout on the countryside. Look at the roads. Look at who's on the roads. Look at the spacing. Look at the green. Next. That's at a different scale. What an amazing pattern. Look at that. That's today. People are living that way. Next. Look at that pattern. Is that not astonishing? That perfect layout of larger and smaller villages, okay, with people living on a very low economic level, but living and probably living well, you know, given the circumstances. Do we know anything about this? These aren't shanty towns. Do we know anything about this? People do. It's just that we don't. Next. And look how amazing this is. That's the Nile Delta. That's what we're looking at. A little part of the world, the Nile Delta. Look how fantastic it is. Okay, that's what we were looking at. So let's look at that. Let's get excited about this. Next. And then there's this stuff. You know what that is? That's a mobile home with a cheap old roof on top, either just tin or sometimes awning. So you combine technologies, you know, give me something prefabricated, let me put something cheap on top. Next. By the way, until 1950, Americans, this is a post office, very well-heeled Americans lived very well in the heat. This is Panama. This is the Panama Canal Zone, which was a civilian city. This is what the post office was like. Absolutely cross-ventilated. Everything about this, you know, the overhangs, the way that sun is shielded, how light and air escapes. What do we know about this? Okay, next. And then there's the perennial problem of the traffic people, the Green Book, that really they're letting us build narrower roads. You know, forget those guys. Go back to the alley. You know, the alley nobody cares about. Just call it an alley. Let the traffic engineers have the road on the other side. Reverse your houses and have them face the alley. The alley, there's no setback in the alley. There are no traffic engineers in the alley. Okay, everybody leaves you alone in the alley. This is a British muse. Just forget the perennial correction of the road. Like oh my God, are we really going to keep fighting that stupid battle, you know, for the road, which is, even when we get a break and it's 10-foot lanes, it's too wide anyway. You know, it's not pleasant for pedestrians. Let's take over the alley. This is a muse. Next. And then there's something that's happening, which Americans are actually figuring things out for themselves. These are people in California, Silicon Valley, living on the sidewalk. You know, not the units are not doing a very good job, but this is allowed. In Salt Lake City, you can now move your unit up to your sidewalk like that and step out onto the sidewalk. Do we know that? Next. Social spacing, how do we do it gracefully? Not like this. This is terrible. You know, in which a social spacing is actually maintained like lepers, you know? No, how can it be done aesthetically? There's a budget for it. Do we do it with a bunch of steel arms like that, or do we do it beautifully? Next. And then there are wonderful places in the heat and in the cold. This is Persia. Do we even think of a room like this? Is this in our repertoire, or are we doing little porches? You know, could this be City Hall? Could this be a place where a charrette can be held? Could this be a place for a public meeting? You know, what do we have as a proposal for government to meet, you know, and gather? Have we looked at this? It's very civil, extremely civilized. Next. These are some of the things we've done. This is an outdoor place called a yard, which is made entirely out of food trucks and containers and canvas. And it's a complete town center with a tent. We bought a tent, that round thing. Complete town center called the yard. And everybody loves it. It's the right aesthetic. Next. Let's look at typologies that can have cars, but very, very, very incidentally. You know, we talk about that. I just heard Strongtown saying, we can't have the car come first. We got to have the pedestrian come first. Okay, well, that's a bumper sticker, but it's like 40 years old. Okay? We talk about it, but we don't do it because we're still thinking of the car. What about not thinking of the car at all? You know? What about the European piazza that happens to have cars parked on it, but it wasn't designed for that, so it's a piazza. The world is full of these. This is what should be in front of us. Next. Here's another thing. This is a studio by famous artists in Palm Beach from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I look at this beautiful space that everybody loves, and I look at it and say, how is this different from a garage? What if we designed our garages with garage doors and we had this in mind instead of just housing a car? What if we raised the ceiling, faced it front, took good care about the garage door, and created a completely multifunctional space that faced the public street? Next. And these are the houses from the 1930s that I was telling you about, 20s and 30s, it was called the health houses. This is called the Lovett Health House. It's all about light, air, terraces, etc. And there was so much of this. And it was health, health, health. And health is exactly what we need now: light, air, and sunlight, breeze, meeting outdoors. Next, getting a tan. Also, another thing is you can actually you can take programs and break them apart into small pieces so that you don't need a corridor. These are shops near, this is actually a strip shopping center near Seaside. That instead of being party wall buildings or God knows no internal corridor, they're just separate structures. They feel very, very healthy. You can do the same thing with hotel rooms. Why have a corridor? Why have an elevator? Why not put everybody right back in the cottages? You know, that's how Florida began. Next. Another thing is there are elements that can be used to keep us, to space us in a very pleasant way. The park I'm going to show you sometime actually uses landscaping, uses trees and palms to keep people at 10 and 20-foot distances, at the same time being delightful. So instead of doing trees and landscaping in a naturalistic way or in an ecological way, you basically say these things will automatically space you and be very nice to boot. You can do the same thing with light. You know, this is not just an example to inspire you, but you can locate light, very low level lights, and the light poles will keep you apart. Or actually, it would actually cause groups to gather. You know, people will gather in the light and not in the dark. So you can keep the groups apart. So maybe only 10 people get sick every night instead of 100 because you're only infecting them 10 at a time. Yeah, I know this is cruel to say, but that's what we're talking about. Keep the groups down. Next. The compound is really what we would be thinking about. We should never think of a single family house and then beg for an ADU. We should begin with a compound. Okay, this is a dwelling of great complexity. Throughout history, this was one in the Southwest, but throughout history, people have lived in compounds. You know, young and old, working, and you know, the boss and the servants and everybody. You can see them in Williamsburg, for God's sake. Next. And then lots of elements that are just there for the taking, like urban walls that become art galleries. You see this all the time. I'm showing you this because I've had to be sensitized to seeing this. And not just saying, oh, that's cool, or that's, you know, that's how the marginalized show their art. No, that's not what that's about. That's a new type that actually, that's an outdoor art gallery. Okay, you don't have to go to a museum. The Met is dead. You know, let's do it out here. Next. Some of our clients are already doing this. This is in Hampstead in North Carolina. And this is, in Montgomery, Alabama. This is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful town that we designed, perhaps one of the most beautiful. And yet for the young people, the young people are just tired of the aesthetic, of the beautiful European aesthetic. They want this, so they built this, the tipping point. This is the cool place. And by the way, this is a playground for the kids. And don't forget that picnic tables are one of the great inventions for spacing. They're wonderful for spacing. Next. And look at this. Okay, you know what this involves? This involves not getting a permit at all. Because we're now, we've gone from lean urbanism to the tentative, tactical urbanism. What about civil disobedience, guys? One of the great things about what's going on now is civil disobedience. When people are rioting and being threatening and everything, it's a perfect time to do something like create a main street like this. Believe me, nobody's going to bust you. Okay? We have been, it's wonderful what's happening, what this is opening up in terms of people taking over public space and says, I'm doing this here. I'm doing this. And you're not going to stop me because this is my right to use space this way. And by the way, I'd be grateful I'm not killing you or rioting. Next. This is clever stuff. Like, for example, these are just 2x4s. And notice that little box at the top. So this is a balcony, but just a little addition, which is quasi-private. Okay, it's not a stupid glass railing, completely clear, that prevents you from using the place. It's also not enclosed. This is something that it seems to me people can hang around and actually be kind of present in public, but not fully. This kind of in-between space, but not at the level of the urbanism, but at the level of the architecture. Next. Parking lots are a great future. We've got to develop typologies, building typologies that can sit on parking lots. There's going to be a million empty spaces, and that's just pennies, you know, in Sears. Million empty spaces. That's the future for new urbanism. What do we do with the dead parking lots? Next. The courtyard house. The courtyard house, which is private and delightful. You know, forget the single, you know, the American, you know, 4 squares sitting in the middle of the lot. What are you going to do with that side yard? This is in a tiny lot in Antigua, Guatemala, and it is all about not only health, and not only safety, but raising your spirits. I mean, you walk into that house and you feel like a miracle has occurred. Is this DNA in our repertoire? No, it's not. Next. Look at the opportunity. Manhattan, okay, is this going to go back to traffic? Or is it a blank canvas? Like when we look at this, what do we look at? Well, there are lots of people already saying, hey, let's throw cafe tables at it. I also want to alert you to this. There are lots of people doing this, okay? And there are lots of people, and many of them are ahead of us, but they don't have the full set of tools. All these people ever come up with is more cafe tables in the streets. What's next? What's next is we have the tools to actually develop what's next beyond just putting cafe tables on underutilized streets. Next. Oh, this is near my house. This isn't a porch. This is called a stoep. It's a South African, it's a little South African terrace. And you sit there on those are concrete benches. This is a South African typology. And you sit there when you want conversation. It costs a small fraction of what a porch costs. Nobody bothers you when it's a short setback. I mean, what are they going to bother you about? This isn't a roofed area. And you're absolutely open for conversation, which very often in a porch you're not. You know, the porch is substantially more private than this. This should be in our repertoire. This is 2 houses down from me. Next. Hedges can keep people separate. This is a very curious but very nice separation. These are 2 neighbors that aren't getting along, close to my house also. And they solved it beautifully. They did a little DMZ. So landscaping, creating DMZs, very interesting idea. Next. Is that it? Anyway, there's so much to say about these houses. By the way, I live surrounded by single family ranch houses. And you know, if you're deprived of truly beautiful buildings, eventually these too become beautiful. I assure you. I've walked past this one 1,000 times and I finally thought it was lovely. Next. And there are many others. Oh, this is great. This is near my house. This is one of the most important slides. 2 things happen here. It's a garage with a tall ceiling. So that what happens inside is all the social activity in the house. This lady in the blue shirt doesn't want to let you into the house, but she'll let you into the garage. And then she had this weird thing in which she put stone on her driveway. She's just made the paving nice. And the neighbors gather there in the evenings, you know, perfectly distanced. It's an almost perfect public space and it's in the front. So you can see that these are people that did not know each other. And I joined the group as well. You just see them meeting and you join them. Next. Next. Streets that are narrow with cars. Next. Oh, this vehicle. Okay. If your vehicles are toxic, if doors and glass don't let you use it, this is the kind of vehicle that actually might become the next Uber. Next. Look at the swales and setbacks in Coral Gables. We can think of so many things to use with that area, but we have to ask City Hall. Why can't we just ask the street, both sides of the street, to make decisions about what to do that? That's where we want to put a croquet set, so that the neighbors can come in and converse. Oh no, we got to ask City Hall. No, sorry, it's got to be at different levels of subsidiarity. Next. And this is Liz's and my $500, absolutely top of the line pool. You know, fantastic comfort. And yet we have internet discussions that say that plastics are bad. Oh, the plastic, that's going to end up in the ocean. Well, you know, there are a lot of other problems before that ends up in the ocean, and a lot of other delights before that ends up in the ocean. And I think we've got to lift our eyes from, what are really tiny problems that are not going to make a difference, and see how much we can do. By the way, this is our courtyard. We've lived there for 43 years. Look at the height of the wall. And this, of course, is illegal, that pool. You can imagine that's not allowed, but the wall protects us. And it is a great comfort in the lockdown to have that thing. It came one day, it came in 2 days. I assembled it myself. It's wonderful. Next. This is a pole barn. They'll build you one of these for $2,000. Tall ceilings outside. Next. Look at it. All sorts of people gather there. This is one of my friends has a pole barn, and all sorts of people, different gatherings. You can't believe the amount of stuff that fits in this pole barn. It's like an antique store. There's so much stuff going on, and all families and friends, they can gather there and still be away. This damn thing costs about $2,500. Next. Picnic tables. One of the most important inventions in the post-COVID world. Next. And then the warehouse, I can tell you a long story about this. This is the warehouse. This is where the young people in my charrette wanted to hang out. Not in the beautiful Main Street that we had revitalized 20 years ago in Birmingham, Michigan. I couldn't get them to stay in the beautiful Main Street that our own firm had revitalized. They would all hang around in the evening in this place. Look at that aesthetic. Next. And look at it. I have to say that when I look at this, it's actually more interesting than the Main Street that we did. I mean, people are so sick of architecture, unless it's superb, unless it's really good, the architecture lowers your spirits. But you get an electrician who's proud of his work, and it's really interesting. This is something which is called a field. And in academia, it's a typology called a field, and it's worth studying. It's something that's not in the new urbanist repertoire. It's something in which fronts and backs are not, basically what it is you have a parking lot that is interspersed everywhere, but it's never too wide, and the buildings don't have fronts or backs. It breaks every rule of the new urbanism, and yet my young crew, that's where they wanted to be, and that's where all the cool shops were. All the cool shops, all the cool little gyms, all the bars were there, not in our Main Street. Next. That's what it looked like. Took Bob Gibbs a long time to understand that actually this was the cool place. Next. The icon. Next. Oh, one thing I was going to say, parking garages too will be unnecessary. And I've always tried to get housing to fit in there, but actually, you know what works in there really well is homeless housing. Not for regular folk, they're not going to do it. But homeless, oh my God, perfect. Perfect. We need to be designing pods, little dwellings for the homeless in the upper floors of parking garages. Next. And this is to remind you that modern architecture with its tube furniture came in order to avoid the unhealthy fabric padding of stuffed furniture. And these are the 870, this is Bob Stern's incredible book. He told me, I didn't count them, that there are 870 towns. New towns in there, half of which are post-1920, and they're independent of the cities. And yes, it had an effect. The pandemic of 1918 had an effect, and I believe that this one will have an effect. And it's completely in our capacity to turn it into something wonderful and not a problem. I think that's the last one. Okay, enough. Thank you. Sorry, it took too long. I don't know whether there's time for questions. You probably have a manager who will tell me.
It is actually time. We have a couple of moments. If there are any questions, if anyone has a question, there's a Q&A box and we can check that. You're also welcome to use the chat function if you have a question. Just a comment that came in, pandemic Duany is the best. I think people are appreciative of you challenging us and making us rethink some of our dogma.
Well, I certainly had to rethink it. but it was disturbing at first and then exhilarating. Once you open, it's exhilarating.
Well, I'm not seeing any more questions come in, but we also have you as a featured speaker on Thursday, where I'm sure we'll continue the conversation. The next session today is with Eric Pate talking about Panama City, not post-pandemic, but post-Hurricane Michael. So thank you, everyone, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Let's go.